He put a sharp rock in his own shoe on purpose, just so the pain would keep his anger real in front of the camera. And that's only the beginning of who James Gandolfini actually was. The same actor who could terrify a room full of network executives once broke down mid-audition, called his own performance garbage out loud, and walked straight out the door. He nearly lost the role that would define television forever. Now the man who knew him best, his closest friend across 6 seasons on that set, is finally telling us who James Gandolfini really was underneath it all. Stay with me. This one gets personal fast. Before there was Tony Soprano, there was a 19-year-old kid from Westwood, New Jersey, and a night that never should have happened. James was dating a young woman named Lynn Marie Jacobson, who worked nights at a banquet hall while studying advertising. One evening, driving home exhausted after her shift, she fell asleep behind the wheel, and she never made it back. James was 19 when he got the news. Then, almost against his will, he admitted the truth. Losing her had changed the entire direction of his life. Without that loss, he said, he doubts he ever becomes an actor at all. Years later, accepting one of his 3 Emmy Awards on a stage in front of millions of people, he quietly dedicated it to her memory. A small, private tribute buried inside one of the biggest nights of his career, as if he still needed the world to know that everything he built afterward had grown out of one unbearable night he never fully got over. He wanted people to know where it came from. That kind of grief doesn't usually hand you a gift, but somehow, for James Gandolfini, it handed him the only thing that could hold everything he was feeling, the stage. So he moved to New York with no real plan beyond surviving. He tended bar. He bounced drunks out of nightclubs at 2 in the morning. And somewhere in the middle of that aimless stretch, at 25 years old, he wandered, almost by accident, into an acting class built around something called the Meisner technique, a method that strips performance down to something rawer than most students ever expect. For most people in that room, the exercises were merely uncomfortable. For James, they occasionally became something closer to unbearable. One particular afternoon has never been forgotten by the people who trained alongside him. Caught up in a burst of real, uncontrolled anger during an exercise, he clenched his fists so violently that his own fingernails cut into his palms until they bled. Instead of stopping him, his teacher pointed at those bleeding hands and told him that exact feeling, raw and unfaked, was the very thing audiences would eventually pay to watch. Most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid feeling that much. James Gandolfini was quietly building a career on doing the opposite, on purpose, for the rest of his life. It's strange, looking back now, how close the world came to never seeing him become Tony Soprano at all. A casting director named Susan Fitzgerald remembered him from a small, menacing role in True Romance and pushed for him to read for a strange new HBO pilot about a mob boss seeing a therapist. James himself assumed the producers would end up casting someone smoother, someone he half-joked would be some Italian George Clooney, rather than a heavy-set, unpredictable actor like himself. When he finally sat down to audition, it went badly enough that he simply stopped partway through, looked up and told the room his own performance was garbage. Then he walked out and disappeared down the street, according to creator David Chase, who watched the whole collapse happen in real time. Most actors never get a second chance after a moment like that. James nearly didn't either, but something about the honesty of that meltdown, the refusal to fake his way through a bad take just to save face, convinced Chase there was something worth chasing underneath it. So the team brought him back a second time, away from the sterile pressure of a formal casting room, into Chase's own garage. And it was there, finally, with the stakes lowered just enough, that James found his way into the role that would define the rest of his life. Even after he had the part, the character kept revealing itself in unscripted moments no one had planned for. One of them changed everything. The original pilot script called for a gentler version of Tony in an early scene with a younger character named Christopher Moltisanti, played by a young actor named Michael Imperioli, softly mentoring him the way a patient father might. James read the page and instinctively rejected it. He grabbed Michael by the collar without warning and shoved him with real, unrehearsed menace in his eyes, nothing about it written on the page in front of him. David Chase has said that watching that improvised moment happen was the instant he realized he was finally looking at the actual Tony Soprano, rather than the safer version he'd originally imagined on paper. From that single, unscripted shove, the entire tone of the show shifted towards something darker than anyone had planned. That accidental collision between two actors in one early scene ended up defining the emotional architecture of the whole series, because Christopher and Tony's relationship, part mentorship and part something closer to father and son, became one of the show's most quietly devastating through lines for the next 8 years. That bond carried well beyond the cameras, even if it wasn't always smooth. Michael Imperioli has admitted candidly, years after the show ended, that there were nights the two of them simply didn't get along, especially late in a long shoot when everyone's patience had worn thin. But he's also said, without hesitation, that at the end of every one of those nights, James was still about as good a man as he'd ever worked alongside in his life. That kind of honesty says more about the friendship than any polished tribute could, because it reveals two people who trusted each other enough to actually be human with one another, rather than perform an easy, sanitized bond for outsiders. And the success that grew out of that partnership turned out to be almost unimaginable by any measure television had seen before. Across 6 seasons, James won 3 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actor, alongside a Golden Globe and multiple Screen Actors Guild Awards. The show itself became the first cable drama in history to win the Emmy for Outstanding Drama Series, eventually collecting 21 Emmys in total, along with a spot at the very top of Time magazine's list of the greatest television shows ever made. He had gone from a bartender in New York with no clear plan for his life to the most decorated, most feared, and most quietly beloved actor on television. And somehow, through all of that ascent, the people closest to him insist he never once let it change who he actually was underneath the performance. But playing a man like Tony Soprano for 6 years demanded a private, punishing cost that rarely made it into the magazine profiles. James didn't naturally carry that rage inside himself, so before difficult scenes, he would deprive himself of sleep for days at a stretch, letting pure exhaustion strip away his composure until the anger came without forcing it. Crew members have quietly described him striking his own head against furniture before an especially brutal take, trying to physically shock his body into the right emotional register. The detail about the rock in his shoe wasn't exaggeration either, according to people close to him. A small, sharp stone tucked into his boot so that every step during a scene carried real discomfort, something true and physical he could hold on to instead of faking the feeling. He admitted in rare, unguarded moments that dragging himself through those dark places night after night left him feeling genuinely awful once he got home. Hollowed out, nothing performative about it. In a very real sense, he was lending pieces of his own private darkness to Tony Soprano, over and over, for years, just so the rest of us could believe every second of it without question. That toll became visible enough behind the scenes that the network eventually tried to intervene in the most literal sense of the word. Former HBO chief executive Chris Albrecht later revealed that he once arranged a private meeting at his own apartment, gathering James's sisters and several of his castmates in a room together, hoping to gently convince him to check into a facility and get real help. James walked in, took one look at the assembled faces waiting for him, and understood immediately what the gathering actually was. According to Albrecht, he simply said, "Forget this," under his breath, turned to the man who'd organized the ambush, told him flatly to go ahead and fire him if he wanted to, and walked straight back out the door. It's a startling story because it shows a man who could be every bit as unpredictable and defiant in real life as the character he played, even while the people around him insist that underneath all of it, the anger was never really the point. It was simply the price he kept paying over and over to give an entire generation of television something it had never truly seen before. If you only knew James Gandolfini from the screen, Michael Imperioli's stories will completely rearrange what you think you understand about the man underneath that performance. Michael played Christopher Moltisanti, Tony's volatile, drug-addled protege, and across 6 seasons, that on-screen relationship, part mentor and part surrogate father, became one of the emotional cores of the entire show, forged in that very first unscripted shove during the pilot. Off-camera, though, according to Michael, there was almost nothing about James that resembled a mob boss at all. He didn't carry himself with menace. He didn't speak in that clipped, threatening cadence Tony used to keep people off balance. Instead, Michael has described the real James as something closer to a hippie than a wise guy. A genuinely relaxed man who wandered around in a loosely tied bandana and a pair of Birkenstock sandals, completely absorbed in music. The kind of guy who'd rather talk for an hour about a record he loved than anything resembling organized crime. And it wasn't only his appearance that surprised people who expected Tony Soprano to walk through the door. Michael has described James as genuinely humble and remarkably intelligent, someone almost self-conscious about the scale of his own fame, rather than energized by it. That made talk show appearances especially uncomfortable for him, since he apparently believed quite sincerely that he simply wasn't interesting enough to sit there discussing himself for 20 minutes. a man who had just delivered one of the most towering performances in the history of television, genuinely felt he had nothing worth saying about it. That kind of humility rarely survives contact with real fame. Yet by every account, it stayed with James the entire way through. Because he didn't naturally live anywhere near the world Tony Soprano inhabited, Michael has explained that James actually had to work his way back into the character before each new season began filming, since it wasn't a switch he could simply flip on command. So James developed a small private ritual. Before production resumed, he would invite Michael out to dinner, just the two of them, specifically to rebuild a certain rhythm of talk and posture that Michael has described as getting back into the swing of things. It was a quiet, almost unspoken rehearsal between two actors who trusted each other enough to admit that the men the world was about to watch again didn't exist naturally in either of them and had to be reconstructed together, one dinner at a time, long before the cameras ever rolled. It's a small ritual, easy to overlook, but it says something larger about how seriously James took the responsibility of that on-screen relationship, treating Christopher's bond with Tony as something worth actively rebuilding every year, rather than a habit he could simply switch back on. Michael has said that whatever tension crept in between them on long, exhausting nights of filming, it never once touched that underlying respect. It's part of why, even now, he still speaks about those years with a kind of protective affection reserved only for the people who genuinely shaped him. The fame that came with the role brought its own strange discomfort too, one that had nothing to do with acting technique and everything to do with how disorienting it becomes to suddenly belong to millions of strangers. Michael has told a story that still makes audiences laugh and wince in the same breath. A fan once approached James in public and, without much warning, lifted his own shirt to reveal a tattoo of James's face permanently inked across his back. James, by every account, wasn't flattered by the gesture so much as genuinely rattled by it, unsettled in a way that never quite left him. There's a related story about fans approaching him at public urinals, trying to shake his hand mid-use, treating basic privacy as somehow optional simply because he was famous. Michael has described James's reaction as pure disbelief that anyone would cross a line that ordinary. But if there's one story that captures who James Gandolfini really was better than any interview ever could, it's the one about the checks. After successfully renegotiating a dramatically higher HBO contract for himself in the show's later seasons, James didn't quietly enjoy that windfall alone. Instead, according to Michael, he called his supporting castmates into his trailer one at a time, privately, and handed each of them a personal check for $30,000. No press release, no public gesture for the cameras, just a quiet acknowledgement that his success had never really belonged to him alone. Other castmates have since confirmed similar acts of generosity throughout the show's run, gifts and gestures that only ever surfaced years later in scattered interviews. Because James never seemed interested in being seen as generous, he only cared about actually being generous. And that's a distinction that says everything about who he really was underneath the character that made him famous. Years later, on the set of a very different project, James's own son, Michael Gandolfini, would step into a young version of that same role for a prequel film, and in doing so, he finally sat down and watched his father's performance in full for the first time in his life, since James had always quietly shielded him from the show while he was growing up. What he found on that screen wasn't the frightening mob boss the world remembers. It was something closer to the man he actually grew up with. Describing Tony Soprano simply as his father in a bathrobe eating lunch on a break between takes. That might be the most honest description anyone has ever given of exactly how far the performance really was from the person underneath it. That gap between the character and the man is really the whole story here, and it's why Michael Imperioli's memories matter so much more than any highlight reel ever could. Put it all together, the humble man in Birkenstocks who dreaded talk shows, the friend who quietly wrote $30,000 checks in a trailer, the actor who bled his own hands and carried a sharp stone in his shoe just to make a performance honest. It becomes much easier to understand why James Gandolfini's death in 2013, at only 51 years old, hit so many people so hard and so suddenly. We didn't just lose one of the most decorated actors of his generation. Michael Imperioli and everyone else who truly knew him lost a friend who spent his entire career quietly giving pieces of himself away, on camera and off, simply so the rest of us could feel something real. That is the man behind Tony Soprano, not a mobster, a generous, anxious, extraordinarily talented man who never once seemed to believe the myth the rest of the world had built around him. So here's the real question, and I genuinely want your honest answer in the comments below. Was James Gandolfini's menace on screen only possible because he was such a gentle private man underneath it? Or did 6 years of becoming Tony Soprano slowly pull something darker out of him, something that had been sitting there all along, waiting for a reason to surface? Michael Imperioli clearly believes it was built entirely from technique, sleepless nights, and a rock hidden in a boot. But you decide for yourself and tell me where you land. And if this story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, hit subscribe, because there are a lot more stories like this one still waiting to be told.